Welcome. I'd like to welcome Clare Longendyke back to Newbury Court. She was here earlier in the year, and she was so good we had to snag her right back. So very thrilled that she's here. She just moved to Chicago 5 days ago, and she just drove across 5 states to be here. And she's now she has a position. She's artist in residence and director of chamber music at the University of Chicago Department of Music. I was going to say that she hailed from Indiana, but since and land of Hoagie Carmichael, but since she just moved to Chicago 5 days ago, I can't say that. However, I will say she is hailed as a superlative pianist. We agree with that. She is a passionate soloist and chamber musician, recognized for her colorful musicality and her personality, I have to say, technical fluency, and ability to interpret repertoires across the musical spectrum. She holds degrees from Boston University, the École Normale de Musique in Paris, Indiana University, the Jacobs School of Music, and in case we're a little parochial here in Boston, we only think Berkeley, New England Conservatory, but for those of you who know the Midwest, the Jacobs School of Music is one of the finest music schools in the world. Please welcome Clare Longendyke.
not yet. There we go. Can you hear me now? Wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be back here in Concord and at Newbury Court. I had such a wonderful experience, and so I was thrilled to be asked to return. As you may remember, I like to chit-chat with you a little bit, to tell you a little bit about the music and to offer you an opportunity to sort of bob your head in agreement or sort of look at me with consternation to tell me if you're liking what I'm saying, to get a little bit of feedback from you. I like that sort of interactive commentary with the audience. That first piece was a piece that I discovered and didn't know until after I had chosen to perform this arrangement by a pianist and composer whose name is Earl Wild, that J.S. Bach also made an arrangement of this piece. I did not choose to go back and change to the Bach rendition, however, because I was so moved by a recording that the arranger himself, Earl Wild, made of this, that I just decided to sort of stick with this lesser-known arrangement of Marcello's oboe concerto, the second movement. The piece is so sad, and actually in its original format, it ends sadly as well. It ends in minor, and what I love about this is that Wild holds you until the very end, and then he ends with a ray of sunshine. He ends the piece in major, and I find that very sort of tranquil at the very end of what is otherwise a very heavy opening piece. The next set of pieces may look familiar to you. I performed 2 movements in February when I was here, the first 2, but I've since decided to tackle the entire set because they are some of my absolute favorites. Mirrors is the English translation of Maurice Ravel's piece Miroir. As you can see, as Jessie told you, I did study in France because I have the accent. I was lucky to to soak in the accent while I was there. There are 5 short movements in this 25-minute work, and each takes on a character, a life, that emulates something within a musical context, but that in itself is not necessarily musical. So the first movement is called Moths, Nocturne. And what's interesting about the title of this piece is that there are actually 2 words in French for moths. The first one, Nocturne, which Ravel chooses to use, is a very scholastic word. It's like the more scientific word for moths. The more colloquial term is papillon de la nuit, which literally means butterfly of the night. I see some nods, so that's what you're more familiar with. I find it very interesting that he didn't choose to use the more colloquial term because that would sort of give it a little bit more of a casual nature in some ways. And here he opts for a more formal transcription, musical transcription of the sounds of what Maud's movement looks like. I know that's a little abstract, but I had the lucky chance to have sort of a community of moths settle outside of the window where my piano is back home in Indiana, because I still have a home in Indiana, so I'm still half Hoosier, even though I just moved to Chicago. And I would watch these moths flock to and from the window as I was practicing this piece, and it's unbelievable the way that even though we see them move as a community, their individual movements are so random and sporadic. Their wing pattern is all very different. Their sizes are, of course, all very different. We have very large moths and very small moths. But what happens is that Ravel captures this randomness of movement and turns it into one larger soundscape. So I hope you'll listen for what sounds a little bit crunchy in terms of rhythm and harmony that's contributing to this sound of the communal movement of moths. The second movement is called Sad Birds. And I think you'll very obviously hear from the very first opening 2 notes this sort of sighing motive of these birds that are just crying into the night. And Ravel actually talked about, he wrote to a friend when he was describing this piece, that the ambiance he's trying to capture is that of birds singing in the very hottest part of summer at the darkest point of a forest, where the torpor of the heat is so heavy that essentially you can cut it with a knife, as we would say in English, right? And the word that for me sticks out there, you may remember from February, is torpor. Because torpor isn't just heat, it's not just humidity, it's an oppressive heat that gets into your bones in a way that cold can as well, but where you just never can feel cool. It's just a heaviness of the atmosphere. The third movement is called A Boat on the Ocean. And this one needs very little explanation. I think you will hear the rocking of the boat back and forth. And then you will probably also notice that the boat hits a couple of storms on its path. But it floats in peacefully and floats out peacefully. So in the end, it does not go through, there are no crashes along the way. It makes it through the stormy weather. The fourth movement is my favorite. It's called the Alborada del Gracioso, or the Morning Song of the Jester. I had a very hard time painting an image of who this jester was for a little while. And then I finally landed on this sort of young man, young Spanish man, because Ravel is tapping into the territory of Spanish music here with sort of strumming guitar motives and Spanish dance rhythms. So this young Spanish man who is a little clumsy. He sort of makes a fool of himself, and he kind of doesn't have a care in the world, and then he sees a beautiful girl. And as soon as he sees this beautiful girl, there's an immediate change in the music, and we start to hear this song, this morning song that he's singing to her to woo her. You can't miss it. There'll be a big hurrah, and then all of a sudden it's just one note that brings in a longer melody. What's funny about this piece is that when the opening material returns at the end, it ends in absolute gusto. I even make a move that looks a little something like this, and you're going to want to clap. I think you're going to want to clap. I hope you're going to want to clap. But I challenge you to not clap, because there is a moment of such intimacy in the transition between this boisterous fourth movement into what is this very kind of oddball of a last movement that is meant to just instill a sense of calm. If you fall asleep during this movement, then the last movement, I would have done my job. The last movement is called the Valley of the Bells. And if you can imagine, somewhere in France or in Switzerland, just a great valley with different cities at every point. And as we come to the hour, maybe 6 o'clock, we hear the echoes of all of the church bells across the valley ringing and coming together in this chorus, so that we can't really tell which are the bells of the church in my town and which are the bells of the echoes of the bells from the church across the valley. So I hope those images guide you through this rendition, my rendition of Ravel's Newbury. Okay, good. I'm so glad. Sometimes, interestingly, when I played the first two, when I was here in February, I was playing in other places and I was only playing the first two movements, and they didn't really strike people by themselves, which is interesting. I think that the impressive ones are 3 and 4, right? The boat and the jester, right? Those are the most impressive ones. But when they come together as a set, they really do tell a story that can't be emulated with just individual movements. So thank you for enjoying that with me. 2020 is a Beethoven year, as we call it. It has been 250 years since Beethoven was born, and every musical organization that you can imagine is going to be celebrating good old Ludi in ways that only musicians know how. Probably drinking lots of beer and playing lots of music, of his music. So I am getting on board with that. I'm excited to be playing 2 Beethoven concerti in 2020. Actually, technically one is at the end of 2019, but don't tell anybody, we'll count it as 2020, although now it's on TV, so but I decided to pick up one of the Beethoven sonatas that I had dabbled with before I started my doctoral coursework, but never performed. And it was a little bit of a regret, so I said, what better time than leading up into the Beethoven year to bring back the Waldstein Sonata. When I was here in February, I played one of Beethoven's sonatas, and I think I asked the room who knew of this piece, and very few of you raised your hands. Maybe 2 of you had heard it live. Now I'd like to know how many of you have heard the Waldstein Sonata live, and I expect that I'm going to hear a lot more hands, or I'm going to see a lot more hands, yes indeed. So this is one of the sort of audience and pianists' cherished sonatas for many reasons. And I think that for me, because I can only speak for myself, the reason that I cherish this sonata is that it has a little bit of everything. The first movement is like running a marathon. It starts on one note, although if you blink, you'll miss it. And by the time we get to the end, about 8 minutes later, you're so out of breath. You should be out of breath too. I mean, listening is quite a feat as well. You can only imagine how I feel. I'm so out of breath that to think about going on to play another 13 minutes of music is almost unthinkable. But he gives us this little sort of reprieve in the middle of these 2 large movements. And what I love about this second movement is that he doesn't even necessarily title it as an individual movement. He calls it an introduction, which almost begs the question, is this a 2-movement sonata or a 3-movement sonata then? Is it just an introduction to this big, beautiful last movement? Or is it truly a movement unto itself? But unless we have any music historians in the room that want to get up on stage with me and have a discussion about this, we'll just let that question sort of hang in the air. And we'll talk about my favorite movement, which is the 3rd movement. The little sort of captcha phrase that I wrote at the beginning at the top of my music in this piece is stargazing. And what I mean by that is I like to picture myself lying on my back in an open field or somewhere on a beach, looking up into a very dark night sky and just seeing stars pop out at me. And those stars are Beethoven's melody that he creates. But of course, if we know anything about Beethoven, it's that Beethoven was not a masterful melodist because he created the most beautiful melodies out of thin air. He was a masterful melodist because he created beautiful melodies out of the nuts and bolts of music, that is to say, scales and chords. And this melody is absolutely no different, but it is so stunning in its simplicity that I just think about looking up into the galaxy and that sort of the sense of calm that I try to have come over me before I start this piece. So I hope you enjoy Beethoven's 21st Sonata by Waldstein.
you.